I'm Robert Dalton Harris. I'm a longtime member of both Ephemera societies, and I think, delighted for the first time to be introducing someone at a conference. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Charles Epting. Charles is a collector and an author, and I believe he was probably a collector first. I understand that his collecting drives his writing, and his writing drives his collecting. The first book that he published some 5 years ago was entitled The History of the Caribbean Monk Seal in Captivity, and I don't imagine that had to do with much collecting. His most recent authorial venture has been a history of Bebe Daniels, a silent film star, and he's done that in conjunction with launching a silent film quarterly, of which 2 issues have appeared. I don't think that's very central to his collecting interests either. But there are a brace of works from earlier, all relating to the LA area where he lives in Huntington Beach. Orange County Pioneers, which is a collection of oral histories. The New Deal in Orange County, and Victorian LA. Additionally, he's written a lot for periodical publications, indicating some of his interests, ranges of interests anyway. His material there has appeared in the American Philatelist, the Missouri Life magazine, Idaho magazine, and several other publications too. He is currently a Young Philatelic Leader Fellow through the American Philatelic Society. Now, we don't have young leaders yet, at least not fellows, except for those that were coming through our Jones Scholarship, but Charles is one of the exemplary kinds of people that can be raised by such programs. He's just recently returned from a trip to Europe where he was at once a guest of the Prince of Monaco at a fancy philatelic operation there, and then he went for 2 months to Frankfurt where he watched the operations of a top-flight auction firm, to return to this country to find that he was now eminently employable and will be taking his first full-time job with an auction firm in California selling philatelic properties. Beyond writing and collecting, Charles is a research associate for the UC Berkeley's Living New Deal program. You can see that, at least through the New Deal aspect, he's capable of very efficiently doing many things out of a single focus. And he serves on the board of the US Philatelic Classics Society, as well as the historic board for the city of Huntington Beach. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a person whom I think we're going to be proud of in the future, if we're not already proud of him now. Charles Epting, please.
I want to thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here. I've enjoyed the talks all morning, and I'm excited to share some of the research and collecting that I've done over the last few years with all of you right now. A little bit of background, full disclosure, I am, as Robert mentioned, a philatelist, a stamp collector first and foremost, but fortunately that takes me off on a lot of fun tangents, and Ephemera is inherently linked to stamp collecting and vice versa, and I think it's impossible to solely focus on just stamps without getting distracted by so much other great stuff out there. So my talk will be sort of split 50-50 between my stamp collecting interests relating to Roosevelt's Blue Eagle, as well as more general ephemera, and then just bigger political issues and pop culture issues that the country faced during the 1930s. For those of you who don't know the NRA I'm talking about, I'm going to start with this. The NRA I'm talking about is not the NRA that is in the news a lot these days. My NRA, as I like to call it, is the National Recovery Administration, which is different from the National Rifle Association. National Rifle Association predates my NRA. My NRA was only around for a fleeting 18 months or so. But whenever I tell people I collect stuff that has to do with the NRA, it turns a lot of heads, for better or for worse, these days. So I wanted to get this out of the way now that I will not be talking about rifles, although there are people who collect that, and I'm sure there's a ton of ephemera related to that. My talk will be about Franklin Roosevelt's NRA. So very quickly, the first couple of slides are going to be very text heavy, and I promise after that it'll be all pictures. So don't be scared off by these first couple of slides. But the NRA is very difficult to describe to someone briefly. It's a government program. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of bureaucracy and red tape and very wordy explanations of things. So I figured rather than try to summarize it for you and put it into my own words, I was just going to go straight to the original documents, to the founding documents of the National Recovery Administration, which was established by something called the National Industrial Recovery Act. So there's these two acronyms, NIRA and NRA, which are often used interchangeably. But just to go back to the very founding of this, the NRA was founded. The National Industrial Recovery Act was proposed to be an act to encourage national industrial recovery, to foster fair competition, and to provide for the construction of certain useful public works and for other purposes, which is a very broad, general, sweeping statement. But fortunately, Section 1 went on to outline very specific goals for this new program that Franklin Roosevelt very quickly established during his first 100 days. So, again, I apologize for the text, but I think it's important to understand the cultural impact of the NRA to actually understand what the NRA was. So Section 1 states that a national emergency productive of widespread unemployment and disorganization of industry, which burdens interstate and foreign commerce, affects the public welfare, and undermines the standards of living of the American people, is hereby declared to exist. So this statement is pretty much confirming that the Great Depression existed. It sort of lays the groundwork for the government to step in and, as Roosevelt liked to think, sort of save the day at the end of the day. So it is hereby declared to be the policy of Congress to remove obstructions to the free flow of interstate and foreign commerce, which tend to diminish the amount thereof. So the situation is so bad economically, the government needs to step in and fix things. The country won't get out of this on their own. They need the government to come in and make some new rules just to make sure that everybody's playing fairly. So to provide for the general welfare, they established 9 different rules. First, to promote the organization of industry for the purpose of cooperative action among trade groups. To induce and maintain united action of labor and management under adequate governmental sanctions and supervision. Third, to eliminate unfair competitive practices. Fourth, to promote the fullest possible utilization of the present productive capacity of industries. Again, these are all very wordy, very verbose government speak, and I'll summarize it at the end. But to go through the others really quickly, 5, to avoid undue restriction of production. To increase the consumption of industrial and agricultural products by increasing purchasing power. To reduce and relieve unemployment. To improve standards of labor, and otherwise to rehabilitate industry and to conserve natural resources. So these 9 rules are pretty much saying the government's going to step in. They're going to regulate manufacturing practices. They're going to regulate labor practices. They're going to regulate purchasing practices. It was sort of a price-fixing scheme, to put it very simply, so that big companies couldn't undercut small companies, so that companies could not exploit their laborers during a time when, frankly, laborers could not afford to be exploited. It was sort of this general overarching code that companies were asked to operate by. And if your company operated by the NRA code, you were allowed to stamp the Blue Eagle logo on your products. And while the government couldn't mandate that people purchase products with the Blue Eagle logo, it was highly encouraged that they only supported companies that were doing their part to help during the Great Depression. So fortunately for ephemera collectors and for stamp collectors and for collectors of anything really, there is this multitude of products between the middle of 1933 and the beginning of 1935 that bear this Blue Eagle logo on them. And it's really wonderful because you can automatically date a piece if it has the Blue Eagle logo to those 2 years. And it provides a really fun sort of area of collecting. For me, at least, I can collect a little bit of everything. As long as it has the Blue Eagle logo, I don't need to limit myself to a certain discipline, to sheet music or to menus or to whatnot. I can collect anything that has a Blue Eagle logo on it, and it all tells part of this big story that was going on in the United States during the early 30s. So I'm going to start the picture part of the presentation with a look at Photoplay magazine from March of 1934. So this is exactly 82 years ago this month. And I went through this magazine, and I pulled out every advertisement that had an NRA logo on it. Because, again, these companies, if they were ascribing to the government's code, they were very proud of that, and they wanted to promote that to their customers. So they were very careful to always put that NRA eagle on everything they did. Advertisements, products, mail, you name it. And you can see even the cover of the magazine in the upper right corner, right under the price, has the NRA logo on it so that people knew that Photoplay was doing their part to help the country during the Depression. So flipping through, you have antiperspirant with the NRA logo. You have seltzer. You have shoes. You have toothpaste. You have eye care. You have lipstick and face powder and shampoo and foods and perfume and painkillers and medicine and pep cereal and you name it. Almost every advertisement in the entire magazine has the eagle somewhere in their ad. And I think that it's really interesting when you would open any magazine in 1933 to be faced with these. It was a very sort of heavy-handed way for the government to get their message across, to require that companies use this logo in all of their advertising if they were part of the code. It always makes me think half the country nearly voted against Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. He was very popular, but there were almost as many people who hated him as who loved him. And while those who supported all of his New Deal agencies and were very patriotic and loved what he was doing, they would have been proud to see all these eagles. But other people, including my grandmother, who still remembers this very well, and I still talk to her about it, her family hated Roosevelt. And when they would see things like this in a magazine, it was an affront to their political beliefs, to their moral beliefs, to their sort of worldview. And I think it's very interesting that this NRA logo, for a very brief time in history, was everywhere. It was one of the most pervasive government symbols in the history of the United States. And you really couldn't escape it. Even if it was opposed to your ideology, you were forced to see it everywhere you looked. And I think that's very interesting. You hear, there's a lot of talk about government programs today and whether it's No Child Left Behind or Obamacare or whatnot. It's usually confined to a political discussion, not being shoved down your throat everywhere you look. As you'll see later, this symbol really appeared everywhere that companies and the government could manage to squeeze it. It just kept appearing. So the story of the NRA starts with a man named Hugh S. Johnson, who enlisted in the United States Army in the early 1900s, served very admirably in World War I, came back and became something of a diplomat and a politician. And he was selected by Franklin Roosevelt to serve as the head, the administrator of the National Recovery Administration. And it was a very big deal. He was on the cover of Time magazine, as you can see, because this was a milestone. This was a keystone to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. The NRA was arguably the biggest of the agencies rolled out in 1933. And a very well-respected military man like Johnson was chosen to be its head. A piece of philately, somewhat ephemera, that I found that I thought was just fascinating is this letter from a prominent Los Angeles lawyer who was, he represented a lot of the major Hollywood movie studios to the NRA. The movie studios even were asked to conform to this NRA code. And unfortunately, there's no letter left, but I can only imagine what Mr. Tannenbaum had to say to Mr. Johnson, because, again, people loved being patriotic and they loved being a part of the NRA, but at the same time, it was very prohibitive, it was very restrictive, it sort of put a chokehold on what you could and couldn't do, which ultimately ended up being its demise, as I will touch on later. So the philatelic part of my presentation, and I promise it will be as brief as possible. In August of 1933, the government released a postage stamp that was, these are the government's words, it was issued to, quote, direct attention and arouse support of the nation to the National Recovery Act. I find it fascinating. Obviously, postage stamps are propaganda, but I think a lot of people think of Germany or Italy or the Soviets during the 1930s when they think of overtly propagandistic postage stamps. And here we have a program that was barely a couple of months old. And already Franklin Roosevelt sort of nudged his buddy, the Postmaster General, who had also been his campaign manager, and said, hey, there's been a lot of backlash about this program. Do you think maybe we could release a postage stamp to help, arouse support? And I think that if any politician today tried to use this tactic to shove one of their programs down the throats of the American people, there would be riots in the streets, which there obviously were for this stamp as well. I'm working on an article and eventually a book on this stamp, and I think that you can make a case that it's the most controversial postage stamp in United States history, which may not sound like a big deal. Most postage stamps aren't thought of as being controversial, but this stamp did upset a lot of people, especially those who were anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal. Were now being forced. This stamp was sold preferentially over the standard George Washington stamp being sold at the time. Roosevelt wanted to ensure that as many people as possible were using the mail as free advertising for the NRA. The design on the stamp, on the left is a man representative of agriculture, a man representative of capital or business, a laborer, and a woman. Roosevelt was very coy at how he used his postage stamps, and he did not want to miss an opportunity to win over the female voters. So he replaced as you'll see in a slide, the original design did not feature a woman, but he specifically asked the designer to put a woman on the stamp because that way women would be more supportive of the NRA and more willing to use this postage stamp. A funny, interesting side note that only happened in the last week, I was, as Robert mentioned, I was over in Europe, and I showed somebody who wasn't a stamp collector asked what I collected. And I carry one of these with me just so I don't have to try and explain what it is. And he said, why does it say US postage instead of USSR postage? And not only was the idea of this stamp very controversial, the idea that a stamp was promoting a government agency, the design is less than ideal because, as you can see, the man representing agriculture is carrying a sickle, and the man representing labor has a hammer with him. And the government claimed that this was a coincidence, and by no means did they intend to offend anyone with their U.S. postage stamp with a hammer and sickle on it. But in 1933, I'm not sure I blame, even if it was a genuine mistake, I'm not sure I blame people for their concern at the design of this stamp. So it's a fascinating little slice of American history, and I think it really goes to show you that stamps are, at the end of the day, just propaganda. The government, more often than not, can have ulterior motives in their production. So this is a great piece of ephemera that I came across last year. It's a photograph that came out of the collection of a man named Saul Glass, who's famous amongst stamp collectors because he served on the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee for decades. He had a big hand in the production and the design of stamps for years and years and years. And this photo was sent to the 12 members of the committee in 1933 for their insight and for their eventual approval. And as you can see, it was originally a scholar located on the right-hand side of the design. That's who was eventually turned into a woman when the stamp was designed. And even after I made this PowerPoint, what I've learned more recently is that I always thought this was a piece of New Deal propaganda. It's been the National Postal Museum describes it as an NRA poster that was adapted to a postage stamp. It was actually a painting done in the 1920s to celebrate the 10th anniversary of World War I. And that's why you can see the arch in the background, the planes in the sky. It was appropriated by the NRA and became a symbol for them on the postage stamp. But it was done even before the stock market crash and the Great Depression. The piece of artwork predates the New Deal by years and years and years. And I think it's very interesting when you superimpose the stamp, you can see that they got rid of all the stuff that was evocative of World War I, replaced the scholar with a woman, and you can see how closely they replicated the design. Here's a couple of other fun pieces from my collection. You can see that pair of stamps is signed by Victor S. McCloskey Jr., who was an engraver at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing from 1930 until 1964, I believe. He had a hand in designing countless United States postage stamps, and a lot of collectors like to get him to sign stamps that he worked on. You can also see on the right a stamp signed on the day it was released by R.L. Bartel, who designed the poster that the stamp was based on. And when I say designed the poster, I mean that very liberally, because he simply stole the design of the painter who did it back in the 1920s. And he worked at the same printing firm that the painter had worked at. I think he dug it up in a drawer and said, hey, nobody will remember this painting. I'm going to use it for a poster. And but at the very least, he did have a hand in designing the stamp, and it's I think fascinating to have one autographed by him. This stamp is also interesting in that I'm sure a lot of you have seen first day covers for stamps. The National Recovery Administration stamp actually has 2 first days, which is very strange, if not unique, amongst U.S. postage stamps. It was going to be released in Washington, D.C. on August 15th, like most postage stamps at the time were released in Washington, D.C. And then a stamp collector and then a congressman realized that there was a tiny town in Iowa that was actually called NIRA, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the acronym for the National Industrial Recovery Act that established the NRA. And they said, wouldn't it be great to have the first day ceremony in NIRA for the NIRA stamp? It was too late. The post office department couldn't change the first day ceremony, but they said, we're going to give you a second day ceremony. So the stamp was released in Washington on August 15th. It was released in NIRA on August 17th, and then it wasn't released to the rest of the country until August 19th. So NIRA, this tiny little town with, I think, 800 people at the time, had their little moment of glory, and for a minute they were on the world stage, but then by 1935, the town had shrunk so much that the post office closed. So here's an article I wrote a couple of months ago about the strange case of NIRA, how a second day of issue almost saved a ghost town. For a minute, things were looking really good for NIRA, and every newspaper, because it was such a novelty to have this little town that happened to have the name of a government agency. The postmaster serviced more mail in one day than he had done in, I think, 10 years prior. And it was a really big deal, but ultimately, and ironically, the town was a victim of the Great Depression that the NRA was supposed to get us out of. So another part of my philatelic collecting that I will go over very quickly are Cinderellas. I don't know if that term is widely used amongst ephemera collectors, but Cinderellas are things that look like postage stamps but aren't. They're Christmas seals, they're labels created for exhibitions, anything that looks like a stamp, has little perforations, but cannot send mail. So here's just an assortment of NRA Cinderellas that I've come across. You have things that are pre-printed matter, whether it's on an envelope or on a letterhead. A lot of companies would just include it in their design. Rubber stamps were very popular, and you see them hit the market fairly often, so that people could just cancel their mail whenever they wanted. Quote-unquote postage stamps, things that were perforated, that had a size exactly the same as a U.S. definitive postage stamp, but were not postage stamps. And then stickers that didn't have perforations but served a similar purpose to put on an envelope, put on a product, put anywhere, really. Another miscellaneous assortment that I've come across over the years. And these are fun. These are, I believe, the last philatelic item I have to show you all. They're labels that were created for the Hobby Collectors exhibition at Rockefeller Center in 1934, and when I saw them, I thought they were just like every other silly commemorative label that was produced for a stamp show. But then when I looked closer, I noticed that the design actually incorporates the NRA logo, and this must have the distinction of being the smallest NRA logo ever, because these things are the size of postage stamps, and you can imagine how small the eagle is on them. And I think it's a testament to how pervasive this program was that you couldn't even buy, philatelic seals at an exhibition without the NRA worming its way into it. So, other things you can collect. I mentioned earlier that the NRA is great for me because it does not limit what I can collect. And these are just a few of the sort of broad, overarching categories that have NRA ephemera in them. I have countless other things. I have somebody thought to save Challenger butter wrappers from 1934. And I never thought they were on eBay, and I never thought I'd be spending that much money on an 80-year-old butter wrapper. And I don't know who in their right mind thought to save these in the first place, but I'm very grateful that they did because now I can spend money on them. Things like Wrigley chewing gum wrappers, coffee cans, all kinds of things have this NRA logo. And as you can see, sheet music is one of the most fun to collect. And these images are not for my collection, but I'm a member of a sheet music group on Facebook. And I knew I was coming here to speak, and I said, hey, does anybody have any sheet music that has this little eagle logo on it? And so many people wrote me with pieces in their collection, and they didn't know what they were. They said, I've been wondering what that NRA, everyone thought it had to do with guns, of course. And it gave me a great opportunity to teach these people a little bit about the NRA. And they said, well, we're going to look out for sheet music that has that now. They became fascinated by it. And it goes to show you that the NRA sort of, it's a cross-section of so many different types of collecting, whether it's sheet music, whether it's cigar boxes. And there's some very fun cigar boxes that are pro-Roosevelt, pro-New Deal. And there's one, it's a great image of Roosevelt's head with the eagle spread out behind him. And a lot of these companies just did whatever they could to not only follow the government code, but also to capitalize on everyone's newfound patriotism. And a lot of times they would just put the Blue Eagle logo on there to sell it to people who loved Roosevelt. It became a very coy marketing tool for a lot of companies. So cigar box collectors probably have NRA boxes in their collection without even realizing what it means. Magazines are another very fun one. I showed that issue of Photo Play at the beginning. Here you can see just an assortment. It was usually the smaller independent magazines in the 1930s that were putting the NRA logo on the cover. National Geographic, Time, Life. They weren't doing this as much. It was mostly these sort of pulpy, I don't want to say cheesy magazines, but as you can see, American Boy, Liberty, Film Fun, which was noted for its extremely risque magazine covers. Love Story was a tabloid of sorts. So, but it's fun when you're looking through a box of magazines, as I'm going to be doing at the fair this weekend. Even if it's a magazine that I don't have any particular interest in, it's still fun to see that NRA logo and to think about going to the newsstand in 1933 and just being bombarded with eagle, eagle, eagle on every magazine cover practically. Clothing. I put this slide in for my girlfriend, who is a vintage clothing collector. And it's been a lot of fun for us because a lot of clothing from between 33 and 35 has tags that attribute this piece to conforming to the NRA code. There were very strict clothing manufacturing codes under the NRA, and companies were forced to put a label or a tag or something in their clothing so that people knew that it was not hurting anybody during the Great Depression, so that it conformed to these government codes that ensured fair trade. So on the left is a hat that I bought my girlfriend that not only was it a very nice hat from the 1930s, but I thought it was fun that it had the NRA code. It gives me an excuse to buy stuff for her. Sewing patterns often have the NRA emblem on them. And then on the far right, you can see a denim work jacket that still has the original NRA code tag in it. And what's very fun is there's a Japanese company that's actually reproducing that exact denim jacket, and they even reproduce the NRA code inside. So that's a very expensive jacket. I wouldn't have to feel bad about wearing it. I can go get a brand new one with a replica NRA code tag in it as well. And then this isn't ephemera, but I want to just show how pervasive the NRA was. The 7 major movie studios in the 1930s all included the NRA logo on their title cards for their films. Paramount, Universal, First National, Warner Brothers, MGM, RKO, and Columbia all incorporated the eagle into their often trademark. You see Leo the Lion, you see the RKO broadcast tower. These are very famous film logos, the Universal Globe, and they managed to work the NRA eagle into them. And I always wonder what it was like if you were a kid or a teen or whoever in the early 30s. if your family were not Roosevelt supporters, of which there were millions of anti-Roosevelt families, and you're going to see the new Ginger Rogers movie or James Cagney or whatnot, and the first thing you see when you sit down in the theater is the NRA eagle. I'm very fascinated by how that made you feel. And the fact that you couldn't even go, the movies are supposed to be an escape. They're supposed to be, a way to get away from reality, a way to just sort of forget about the troubles of the real world. And here you're greeted with a reminder that the government has a very heavy hand in industry and that the country's in bad shape. And I think it's just a very fascinating sort of psychological part of this country's history, that the NRA was literally everywhere. And I think that it is unlike any other government agency in history, that you literally could not go down the street without seeing a billboard or a sign in a window or a film or whatnot without that NRA eagle. And I wish I had the video with me, but there's a movie from 1934 called Footlight Parade, one of the great Warner Brothers Busby Berkeley musicals. And the first time I watched it, I was floored because in one of the dance, there's always the great dance scenes where they have the aerial view of the dancers, and usually they're spinning in a circle or whatnot. And in one of the final numbers in the film, the dancers actually formed out the NRA eagle. And the film is not political at all. It's about a struggling guy who writes prologues to little scenes that are shown before movies. And just randomly, all of a sudden, they jam the NRA into it. And they never mention it. They never explain why it's there. It's just a very random inclusion in the film, I thought. But it goes to show that the NRA was everywhere. This is something that, for a very fleeting moment in American history, you could not escape. So I'm going to end with the fate of the NRA. What happened? Why don't we still have it today? Why did it go away so quickly? There was a Supreme Court case called Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States. The press very quickly dubbed it the sick chicken case. And that's because the Schechter Poultry Corporation had an issue with sick chickens. The government was restricting them in how they could sell their product. They felt like the government overstepped its bounds. And the Supreme Court unanimously declared that the National Industrial Recovery Act was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court was fairly stacked with judges that had been appointed during the 1920s under Coolidge and Hoover particularly, who were not crazy about all of Roosevelt's policies. But the NRA was the other programs that Roosevelt started during the first 100 days were the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, things that were not as controversial, things that it would not have been as easy for the Supreme Court to take down. But the NRA, I think, is where Roosevelt went a little bit too far. I think he took one step too far in his government response to the Depression, and the Supreme Court latched onto it and got rid of the NRA as quickly as possible. It is the only of Roosevelt's agencies from the New Deal to have been struck down as unconstitutional, and we still have many of the New Deal agencies today: the Tennessee Valley Authority, Social Security, FDIC. A lot of these agencies have survived very well, but the NRA was the one, and I think Roosevelt understood this. In 1935, he rolled out what's called the Second New Deal, when agencies like the Works Progress Administration were founded. And everything is very tempered compared to the reach that he tried with the NRA. So I think that he even knew that he overstepped his bounds. The Supreme Court definitely knew it. There were calls from General Johnson for a new NRA statute, but ultimately it died a death as quickly as it had been formed. The postage stamp was pulled off sale. Companies removed the NRA eagle from their products, and that was the brief and fleeting history of the NRA. You see these pieces of ephemera everywhere with the eagle, and they immediately take you back to a very brief, less than 2-year period of American history that I think is just fascinating, and I think really shows the heavy-handed, prominent role that the government played in people's lives during the Great Depression. So if I have a couple of minutes for questions, I'd love to take them, but I thank you all for your attention and your interest, and thank you. Uh-huh.
image in the historic, the 1920s one, was feared to be looking too much like FDR.
Yeah, so it is commonly stated that the businessman was modeled on FDR, and that they put a mustache and a hat on him to try and disguise him. And it certainly bears a resemblance to FDR, but that theory appeared in the newspapers in 1933. Oh, Roosevelt's on a stamp, which obviously went against the standard practice. The fact that the painting dates from 1928, though, I think disproves that. I think that was something that was sort of stirred up to sort of make a news story out of nothing in 1933. It definitely bears a resemblance to him. This is a photograph of the poster, which was based on an earlier painting, which I don't have an image of with me. But the earlier painting, it's a slight resemblance, but it's not enough. If I saw it, I would never say that's FDR. Yeah, absolutely. And really quick, not to take up too much time, but the other big controversy about this stamp is that 3 of the figures have their left foot forward, and the businessman has his right foot forward. So the newspapers quickly ran with the idea that business is out of step with the rest of the country. Business is out of step with agriculture, labor, and women. And again, was it a coincidence? Perhaps. Should the government have probably thought of these things before printing 1.8 billion of this postage stamp? Absolutely. So excellent point, and thank you for bringing that up. Thank you all again, and in the very back. Yeah, I went to USC. I studied history and geology, so I have 2 very disparate paths that I ended up picking history over geology, obviously. I have been unable to figure out who designed the NRA Blue Eagle logo. There are sketches of it in the National Archives collection. Very early, it looks like marker or watercolor drawings of it, but unfortunately they are unattributed. And it's a very basic United States patriotic design. It's not too different from designs that the country's been using since the 1700s. But that's something I've wondered, and something I'm trying to get to the bottom of, is who created this very famous Blue Eagle logo that you can see on literally everything from 1933. Uh-huh.
Was there an executive branch office responsible for checking whether the companies who put the Blue Eagle on their magazines and on everything actually complied?
Yes, code compliance was a huge deal, and a very quick anecdote that I find hilarious. The Cinderellas, the labels that were being produced of the Blue Eagle, the largest manufacturer of them, printing I think 1 million a day, was a company named the Ever Ready Label Corporation. And in 1934, it was a major news story when it came out that the government was shutting the Ever Ready Label Corporation down for non-compliance with the NRA code. So they're printing labels advertising the NRA code, and their own production methods were not in accordance with the code. So the government, there were people always scouring the country, making sure that everything was by the book. And companies were blacklisted, were shut down, were ostracized if they. It was against the law to use the symbol if you were not compliant in the code. So that was a very big part of the enforcement of the act. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.